Israeli strikes continue to reverberate across Iran and the broader Middle East. We explore what these dramatic developments mean for great power competition and regional hedging in the Indo-Pacific. Today's wide-ranging discussion examines how the 2025 US National Security Strategy, economic securitisation, alliance dynamics, and rising geopolitical tensions are reshaping strategic calculations for middle powers caught between Washington and Beijing. Hello and welcome to the Security Affair, the flagship podcast of the Center for International Security and Economic Strategy, or CISES, where we explore strategy, defense, economics, and international security. I'm Alexander Anderson, Director of Policy at CISES. I'm joined by Dr. Jack Butcher, Adjunct Lecturer of International Security at the University of Adelaide and inaugural Japan-Australia Dialogue and Exchange Fellow with the United States Studies Center and the Japan Foundation, to unpack how US strategy, great power rivalry, and recent regional conflicts are influencing the logic of cooperation and competition in the Indo-Pacific. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
Diving right in, the 2025 US National Security Strategy appears to recalibrate Washington's global policy towards a more assertive posture with China, emphasizing economic independence and deterrence. How does this shift in doctrine affect the underlying logic of cooperation and competition in the Indo-Pacific, especially for middle powers that have relied on economic interdependence with Beijing, alongside security ties to Washington, given that the US is securitizing economics?
Okay, so I think we've been seeing this building up very much under Trump 1.0. So under the first Trump administration, they released the Indo-Pacific strategy. And the Indo-Pacific strategy very much aimed to constrain China's influence or growing influence in the Indo-Pacific at the time. So what we saw under one of Trump's main advisors, Matt Pottinger, is we saw a shift in particular towards economic competition. And that came particularly through Trump's trade war, when he began launching the trade war against China. And that carried over very much as well to the Biden administration as well. So as we saw the COVID-19 pandemic break out and all the chaos that was also surrounding that too at the time, the Biden administration also understood, and largely because of shifting power dynamics, that the main area or the main focus of the US's strategic policy will be on China, and particularly the Indo-Pacific, and particularly on China. So what that meant is that the United States was looking to work with allies and partners in the region to form a strategy called integrated deterrence. And what integrated deterrence wanted to do was the aim was to integrate the US's hard power capabilities with its soft power capabilities to form also smart power capabilities as well in the middle. So this required the US to work extremely closely with allies and partners. But under Trump 2.0, as we've seen the recent chaos and the general movement under the Trump administration, is we've seen this pressure continue to some extent, but at the same time, we've also seen a shift very much back to unilateralism. So what's going on at the moment is that the United States is looking increasingly elsewhere from the Indo-Pacific. That's one aspect of it. But another thing as well, and connected to the US is shifting its priorities back towards the Western Hemisphere and also the Middle East, we've also seen, and you would have maybe seen in the NSS as well, you would have seen an emphasis upon what they call burden shifting in particular. And that seems to be, from all intents and purposes, is very much an America First strategy. So they are interested in, over the long term, I think personally, that they want to shift the, let's say, the focus of their defence policy and the burden towards those states in the Indo-Pacific, like Japan, Australia, the Philippines, states that are a part of the what they call the hub and spokes alliance system in the Indo-Pacific. So yes, I think what this means is that the competitive aspect is going to continue, but also the cooperative aspect as well, particularly with economics between the states in the region. So very much Japan, Australia, the Philippines, ASEAN member states, they're going to increasingly work with each other to try to diversify those areas of trade. So we're seeing this competitive dynamic continue.
So, linking back to one of the aspects you mentioned, the new NSS departs from previous ones in the fact that it stresses the Western Hemisphere as the primary sphere of influence and operations from the US, calling back the Monroe Doctrine for the 21st century. It also stresses the importance of the US in Asia, specifically in the First Island chain, and highlighting the economic importance of the South China Sea for trade. It does, however, sum up its approach to Asia as win the economic future, prevent military confrontation. How should we interpret this shift onto the Western Hemisphere, as well as onto economic rather than purely security competition, and what incentives does that create for hedging Indo-Pacific states?
Well, I think first we have to look at Trump's ideology, right? His domestic ideology. So we have to look at his doctrine, which is America first. But also as well, it's not always America first as well. We have to understand there's a lot of contradictions in Trump's thinking, because it seems very much from a lot of the expert analysis is that Trump doesn't think in strategic terms. He thinks very much in dispositional states. So he has these states of being that he seems to go from one idea and then jump completely to another, right? So what this fundamentally means is that, okay, we can say that there's a broad contours of America first. So this has manifested, of course, in a increased focus on the Western Hemisphere, because that's where the belief about illegal migration and also the belief of drug trafficking has come from as well. And as we've seen what the United States has done, particularly vis-a-vis Venezuela, and also blowing up boats as well in the Caribbean Sea. And there's a natural resource dimension to this as well. What we see is that the United States is increasingly prioritizing access to oil, as we've seen. So Venezuela is certainly one of those key targets. And now we're seeing with Iran. So what this in some ways is as well is that this seems to be a multi sort of, it seems to be very knee-jerk, but interestingly, there is a sense that the United States is prioritizing itself, it's prioritizing its own economy, it's prioritizing its own development, particularly vis-a-vis China, and also ensuring economic growth. But another interesting thing too as well is that as the United States focuses more on the Western Hemisphere and focuses more on the Middle East, what we're actually seeing is the temperature somewhat in the Indo-Pacific, particularly compared to the Biden administration, is actually coming down a little bit, which is a good thing for Indo-Pacific states, because this actually gives Indo-Pacific states greater room to hedge, because they won't be under as much pressure from the United States or China to potentially choose sides. As well, this also opens up, particularly with the United States shifting its focus away from the Indo-Pacific, is that now there will be more options for hedging states. So when we talk about economic competition increasing, states in a lot of ways believe that they can actually now get a better deal, and they can actually hedge without that certain fear that, as I said, that the United States is going to, or China is going to force them to choose sides, right? So you can see how I think personally, and I genuinely believe that this does create incentives for states to hedge rather than align with China or align with the United States.
So continuing with the economic theme, how does this competition model look like in the Pacific, given the tariffs that the US has been enforcing on Southeast Asia, on nearly every country in the region last year as well as this year? So
another interesting thing as well is that if we look at the economic interdependencies, for instance, regional states' economic interdependencies with the United States, of course, are going to be harmed because of the tariffs. There's no doubt about that. But what I think is going to happen is that states now are going to be able to hedge and are also going to be able to gain a lot more from China, are potentially able to gain more from the infrastructure projects that Japan's offering, and also the infrastructure projects that Australia is also offering in the region as well. What I think one of the things that more or less the United States' tariffs have done is actually going to lead states to increasingly opt to cooperate and trade closer with each other rather than with the United States, which fundamentally means that these states can get a better deal from the economic competition, but also as well, we also can see that this intra-regional trade, which I think is going to increase over time, is actually going to intensify our competitive dynamic. So in some ways, it's going to make states consider even more the potential costs of getting into alignment or potentially declaring alliances, i.e. with the states like Vietnam who are non-aligned, but who may have thought before that they wanted to align more with the United States. What this does is it actually incentivizes them to hedge even more.
So, moving away a bit from the region, the capture of Nicolas Maduro by US forces in January has broad implication for perceptions of US willingness to use force unilaterally. How might this precedent affect strategic calculations in the Indo-Pacific, particularly among states balancing US security guarantees with concerns over sovereignty and domestic legitimacy?
Well, personally, I don't think that US allies and partners really have much to worry about. As we saw last year in the Shangri-La dialogue, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth committed to cooperating with allies in the security realm. So the likelihood that the United States is going to, i.e. extract one of their leaders is very minimal. But I think what's going to be really interesting here is to see and to understand how China and North Korea are potentially viewing this, because they have been before at the let's say the tougher end of the stick when it comes to US policy. However, one of the things that certainly is in their advantage is that these states actually have nuclear weapons, right? So this actually does enable them to have a degree of deterrence, to go in and say, well, look, I'm a strong state. You can't extract my leader. You can't invade my territory. You can't take my economic resources and whatnot. So in a lot of ways, the China increasing its nuclear arsenal, and also North Korea having nuclear weapons, definitely deters those options from happening in the Indo-Pacific. One of the reasons why Trump was emboldened to go in and extract Maduro from Venezuela is because Venezuela is weak. It's a weak state. It doesn't have the ability to project much power vis-a-vis the United States, and it's also geographically very proximate to the United States. So the cost for the United States military to go out there is significantly less, right? So I think what we see in this case is that Indo-Pacific states don't have much to really worry about the United States intervening in their internal affairs or whatnot. But one country that probably would have some concerns, and I don't think it's very much on Trump's radar, because I don't really think the Trump really knows where it is, or many in the administration know where it is, but Myanmar, right? So Myanmar, and we heard last year as well that the Trump administration was liaising with Thailand to potentially station assets in Thailand if, say, the Myanmar conflict escalated. But at the moment, it does not seem that Myanmar is going, or the Indo-Pacific, or in that sense, is really in the Trump administration's remit currently.
Okay, thank you. With US-China competition intensifying and US strategy seeming to privilege decisive actions abroad, how do Indo-Pacific states reinterpret Washington's reliability as a anchor of strategic stability? Are they more likely to decouple alliance commitments from economic engagement? And what structural incentives drive those sorts of choices?
So I think what we've seen now, is the United States is now considered en masse in the region to be a source of uncertainty. Now, we did see this to some degree under Trump 1.0 because of the uncertainty with the way the Trump administration was signalling the tariffs that it was putting on its East Asian partners like Japan and South Korea, and also the trade war it launched against China. So I think states have had quite a lot of warning that the Trump administration was seeking to decouple its economic engagement. But I'm not particularly sure how they are likely going to decouple their alliance commitments really from their economic engagement, because the United States is still an extremely important ally for these countries in the region. And there is a general consensus, particularly here in Australia, that they would like to try and wait this out to see if okay, what happens in 2028? Will we get a new president? We most likely will, but we don't know, of course, with Trump's potential designs on power, as we know domestically. But I think what we had, one interesting thing as well is that historically, the United States, particularly under Obama and somewhat under Biden as well, was seen as a source of strategic stability. Now it seems that China's increasingly being seen as a source of strategic stability, despite the fact that it does have designs on Taiwan. So, and this in a lot of ways is because China has shown a significant more amount of continuity in its policies. And so therefore, I think China is, and another interesting thing as well I mention is that China, because China has proven itself to be a very reliable economic partner, states will not abandon they will not decouple from China, and they will not decouple from each other.
Thank you. So shifting from the perception of the US to the perception of China, do events in Venezuela in January and now in Iran reinforce the perception of China as primarily an economic partner rather than a genuine military, security and political ally? In particular, does the absence of security guarantees or concrete support to those two states, as well as the apparent failure of Chinese-supplied radars and surface-to-air missiles to ultimately protect the regimes that purchased them, strengthen that view?
So China, and this is one thing I think a lot of analysts, tend to downplay or not look at so much, is that China does have a long history of non-interventionism. There is a norm within Chinese foreign policy that talks about non-intervention. And that certainly goes back to, firstly, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is a normative framework for Chinese foreign policy. So every time China enters relations with another state, the state has to agree to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And one of those principles, of course, is non-interventionism. And this stems back from its history in the 19th and 20th centuries, resisting European and Japanese expansionism. So China, because of these norms in its foreign policy, but also because it doesn't want to be seen as potentially too aggressive, and also doesn't want to directly challenge the United States either, it's very much hesitant to become involved in foreign conflicts. And one of the biggest examples we've seen is in Myanmar, right? Because recently there was even, with the civil war going on in Myanmar, there was even shooting and bullets that actually crossed the Myanmar-China border during the civil war. So you can see how even to a state next door, a neighbouring state, China is very reluctant to intervene. With Iran, it's the same, right? And we've even seen this with Russia in the war with the war in Ukraine as well. Is that yes, China has been providing dual-use technology to Russia, but at the same time, it is very reluctant to get involved directly in that conflict because it knows it does not want to have a showdown with the United States. So you can see how the deterrence there is still very much working on the United States' part. But also China as well does have that history and that norm of non-interventionism I was talking about.
Okay, thank you. The proliferation of multilateral platforms in the Indo-Pacific is often described as hedging. to what extent are these formations a reaction to perceived unpredictability in US global strategy? As we've mentioned, it's seen as a vector for instability, and to what extent are they endemic to regional distribution of power?
So I think the unpredictability of the US's long-term commitment certainly seems to be one of those aspects. And as I was saying just then, is that we saw this under Trump 1.0, and this was one of the reasons why Japan, Australia, and India came together, or particularly Japan and Australia came together to revive the Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue in our region, because fundamentally the Quad aimed to keep the United States engaged in the region, to remind Donald Trump the importance of the Indo-Pacific to Trump's broader worldview, because they were very much concerned at the time that the US was drifting towards a neo-isolationist foreign policy. So certainly there was the sense that, particularly among US allies like Australia and Japan, that if the United States were to leave the region, it would be detrimental, particularly for their own security, particularly their national security and also their economic security, as we know, because Australia and Japan are maritime nations, so they very much rely upon the sea, particularly the sea lines of communication. So this is one of the reasons why the United States, or one of the reasons why Japan and Australia came together to ensure that the United States remain engaged in the region. And they also wanted to ensure that India was also engaged as well, because, of course, India is a rising power in our region. So there was that element there too. And also at the time as well, India was having its own problems with China, as we noticed with the border disputes that they've had with China over the last 50, 60 years. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it as well is China's growing power is certainly another element, right? So as realist theory tends to say, that when there's shifts in the balance of power, states tend to become very uncertain about their regional environment. They tend to be very concerned about their strategic surroundings. So they understand, and they've also looked through history, that yes, look, rising powers can potentially be quite dangerous. So they know that China has designs on Taiwan as well. So they're very much concerned about that aspect. And as well, another aspect of the proliferation of unilateral platforms as well is also to try and counter China's growing influence through its strategic partnerships and also through its economic relationships and its enmeshment into regional multilateral institutions, because China has an alternative strategic vision called the Community of Common Destiny. It's also called the Community for a Shared Future. And that vision states that if China wants to achieve a multipolar world, or a more orderly and multipolar world, which they call in Chinese 平等有序国际化. And also as well, China also has a strategy of making partnerships and not alliances. Even though that's very much a strategy in the way it conducts its own foreign relations, we also do see that China also wants to promote that externally. And so the ultimate aim of the China's Community of a Shared Future is to also hollow out the US's alliances in the region by trading more with US allies and enmeshing itself more into regional multilateral institutions. So this kind of uncertainty has very much led, particularly regarding the United States' commitment and also China's growing power, which we could talk about, and that's certainly a structural incentive there, to counter that uncertainty, right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Shifting to a different topic, how would you say recent US operations influence elite narratives about sovereignty and normative constraints of international order among Indo-Pacific middle powers? Are we seeing a redefinition of the rules-based order that privileges outcomes over process?
So I think what we're seeing at the moment, particularly the United States' operations in Iran and also in Venezuela, I think what we're seeing is that faith in the old rules-based international order, I think, has been completely shattered. the best case scenario, of course, would be undermined. But I think they understand that we now live in a world where might makes right. So states, they understand because of, and it has relied for a very long time, particularly that stability has relied upon the United States adhering to those rules, adhering to those the principles enshrined in the UN Charter and also internationally. But one of the big problems is that I think there's an increased understanding that we now, even though that at the moment it might not seem like there's much that states can do, is that when the United States more or less calms down internationally, and if it does become more predictable again, if we see the exit of Trump, is that the international order has been, and particularly the regional order, also in the Indo-Pacific, but the international order has been ruptured so much that states, particularly states like the US, China, India, Japan, the EU as well as a multilateral organisation, the UK, may have to come together and potentially work out a new kind of arrangement, because we know that this has not been working and it's completely fallen apart. So this is where I think personally that we may see a redefinition in the future of a rule, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. Thank you. Does Washington's recent use of force across multiple theatres create credible deterrent signals to revisionist actors in the Indo-Pacific, or does it simply, or does it amplify fears of entrapment and strategic ambiguity among US partners? And what would you say are the internal institutional logics within these states that shape their response?
So I think Washington's use of force across multiple theatres certainly does create signals to potentially revisionist actors, right? So I think, particularly for China, I think if we look at Taiwan in particular, I think what Trump's unilateralism does is I think it actually enhances the strategic ambiguity rather than decreases it. So that's certainly one aspect of it, I think. Another aspect as well is that just let me think for a moment. That as well is that it does also raise concerns about entrapment risks as well, because the United States could, and I think we've just seen this recently with Trump's response to Spain over its decision to not allow the United States to use its bases for operations in the Middle East. So that's certainly one of the responses that Indo-Pacific states could find if they resist an order or resist a request from the United States to potentially get involved in a conflict. So I think internal institutional logics, of course, it depends on the country, right? So US allies in particular, you can say from Australia's case in particular, we do have a very strong tradition of great power alliance. So we have relied on the ANZUS alliance since 1951. Australia has has participated in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan alongside the United States. So an internal institutional logic going on, particularly with foreign policy thinking within Australia, is generally that it wouldn't be normal for Australia to refuse any such request in the Indo-Pacific.
Okay.
So institutional logic certainly shaped their response there too, yes.
Okay, thank you. The domestic political logic of US foreign policy appears increasingly shaped by electoral and populist incentives. A good example of this are the upcoming midterms. How does this affect allies in the Indo-Pacific, where long-term strategic signaling might be undermined by these short-term domestic political cycles and gains?
I think states are used to a level of volatility in US foreign policy. I think, as we see generally every 4 to 8 years, the government in the US changes, and therefore US foreign policy priorities also change. So there is that element there as well. But I think as well, particularly if we see this populist movement, particularly in the United States, become further entrenched, I think we might see we might see US allies in particular begin to become quite concerned that the US might not be a stable partner long term, right? So when we look at Trump in particular is that when we talked about before about the 2025 national security strategy in particular, is that emphasis upon what they call burden shifting in particular. States, I think, will increasingly look to increase their defence spending, and also will look at the same time to increase their strategic autonomy as much as they possibly can, and also their own deterrent capabilities domestically, which may see them acquire. And in the worst case scenario, like a country like Japan may even potentially acquire nuclear weapons if it does not feel that the United States commitment can be credible. So certainly the internal logics of US foreign policy do affect how US allies in the region do calculate their relationships with the United States. However, in 2028, if we do see a US administration, if we do see a Democrat administration come in, or maybe if Trump leaves and the Republicans elect another leader that might be more moderate, which I don't see really happening as much. We just don't know, right? But what we could see is that the old sense of stability may return, and US allies in the region may feel more secure about their ability to protect their own security from threats coming from either China, North Korea, and also non-state actors as well.
Okay, thank you. So, shifting from middle power to great power behavior, how would you say the developing situation in Iran and elsewhere would alter great power behavior in Asia?
So I think at the moment, and this is I think China in particular would be somewhat, would be looking at this very carefully, right, about what the United States is doing. So in one way, there would be a sense of, okay, Trump's unpredictability, as we were talking about before, could constrain very much their decision-making vis-a-vis Taiwan. They might think, oh, it's just too unpredictable, we may not move at it. Particularly if this is a fairly short bombing campaign, if it's only, say, 4 weeks, and we wait till everybody runs out of missiles and Trump goes home, well, then the US Navy goes back to the US. We don't know. But I think another interesting thing they will also be looking at is that if the United States gets bogged down in this conflict, we may even see China may even want or even try to potentially launch an invasion of Taiwan, particularly if the United States is destructive, right? So there certainly is that risk there. So I think China is very much looking at this situation at the moment going, well, okay, a strategic window of opportunity may emerge, and if Trump gets bogged down in Iran, maybe China could strike. But as well, China also likes to play the long game as well. So we also know that, China has had designs on Taiwan for 70, 80 years, since the end of the Chinese Civil War, since 1949. So what we could see is that China decides, okay, this strategic window of opportunity might not be worth taking because the ambiguity is just too significant, right? It's just too much. So it's really hard to predict how China would potentially react, but there are two scenarios there certainly to think about.
Thank you. Given the conceptual linkage between strategic narratives and material strategy, how would you say competing visions like the free and open Indo-Pacific interact with US doctrine as seen in the National Security Strategy and in January's National Defense Strategy, and the priorities in those documents?
So the United States under Biden in particular was certainly seeking to rally its allies around the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, and particularly the United States' retrenchment with multilateralism in the region as well, and the concept, and norms of liberal values, freedom of navigation, free trade, and things like that. So that was very much a rallying call, which allowed the United States to not only physically integrate its deterrence, but also normatively rally its allies in the region behind the cause, right? To rally the region's powers behind the United States, and to also reassure them that the United States is going to be there in the long term, right? But as well, we also see that the Indo-Pacific strategy as well, and this is a very important part of it, is that it was also designed very much to counterbalance China's community of common destiny vision, right? Or its community for a shared future vision, which the United States did not agree with. So the United States wanted to ensure that it remained the region's foremost power, the most trusted power in the region, and committed to its allies' defense. But China doesn't see that the same way. China would prefer that alliances in the region be hollowed out or completely abandoned. And it would also certainly prefer a power sharing arrangement with the United States, which the Biden administration could not really accept. Now, I think under the current Trump administration, Trump 2.0, it seems, particularly from their behaviour, that they are more comfortable with the idea of potentially sharing power with China in our region. So the big concern, and this is a big concern for US allies, because US allies, particularly Japan, feels very uncomfortable with that, because a country like Japan that's very much reliant on maritime trade could see the potential for China to create its own sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific and push the United States out. And if that's the case, there is the potential for China to be able to coerce Japan's access, particularly to its markets in Southeast Asia and also its natural resources and its raw materials that it needs from Australia and also the Middle East, right? So certainly that there is.
To what degree would you say the spectre of broader geopolitical conflict illuminated by Iran's reaction and retaliation to US allied states that didn't, for example, directly participate in the strikes themselves, incentivize Indo-Pacific states to invest in independent deterrence capabilities versus deeper integration into their existing security alliances and embedding deeply within existing security architecture?
I think particularly Iran's reaction to leadership decapitation, as we've seen over the last couple of days, we've seen that Iran has struck at US bases in the region in particular. We've seen that it's very much willing to show that it's not going to accept what the United States is trying to do to it. And one country in our region, certainly, that would feel that they made the right decision, of course, would be North Korea, right? Because as we can see from George W. Bush, former US President George W. Bush's former speech about the axis of evil, Iraq is down and out. Iran could be down and out now. We don't know. I think the Iranian leadership, given its structure, and particularly its multi-layered structure, may hold out a lot longer than the United States and Israel were anticipating. But we also saw Libya as well, right? We saw what happened with Muammar Gaddafi. So a country like North Korea would be thinking, well, look, we've gone against international law. That might not be a big consideration for them, but at the same time, they may have strangled their potential for greater trade in the region, but that cannot be exchanged for security, right? So this may also, in the future, also look at, if from what we were talking about just then in the previous question was about China potentially creating a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific, right? We could potentially see that that countries like Japan and South Korea concerned that, okay, if China somehow changes it has a leadership change and it somehow goes through a different way of thinking and becomes somewhat more interventionist, because that's the biggest fear that countries like Japan and South Korea do have, is they may be incentivized to then adopt and develop and then and develop nuclear weapons, right? So these are big considerations for particularly regarding geopolitical conflict, because as we've seen, since the end of the Cold War is that adopting nuclear weapons has deterred great power war. We didn't see the US and the Soviet Union come into direct conflict with each other. So states maybe, particularly Japan and South Korea, may be looking at those logics, but I don't think, particularly as China, even though it has asserted its maritime dominance in the South China Sea and has militarized it, and it does have designs on Taiwan, I think states in the region also realistically understand that China is not going to invade them tomorrow, unless will get attacked tomorrow, unless they intervene in a conflict in Taiwan, right, which we may see the destruction of US facilities or Japanese facilities in Okinawa or even Northern Australia or things like that. But I think they know that China is not going to invade. That's generally
How do recent US interventions influence middle power normative agency? Are states in Southeast Asia, East Asia, Oceania repositioning their strategic narratives to stress institutional order and norms as counterweights to great power unilateralism?
I think states in the region, as we've seen, the reactions to the US's actions in Iran, we have seen a lot of states, particularly Singapore is one. Indonesia has been very careful with its words. Australia has also not mentioned international law. We've seen, and Japan hasn't either. So we've actually seen a general apprehension, particularly on the part of those states, to come out and actively condemn what the United States is doing in Iran at the moment. The only state that we've actually seen that's had any kind of response to what the US is doing in Iran at the moment is Malaysia. Malaysia has come out and condemned the US's action as against international law, as violating international law and the UN Charter. So I think that reluctance, at the moment, their strategic narratives are to de-escalate the situation as much as possible, right? Because they don't want to see this get out of control, because the potential ramifications for the conflict worsening is that, and as we've seen, Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz, now we could see oil prices rise significantly, and that will influence how their citizens in particular are able to pay for things like fuel, right? And also affect their access to fuel as well. So this is a big issue, right? But I also think too is that as well, there is also a sense too that states also don't want to be seen as contradictory. And I think in Australia's case in particular, I think is that if Australia came out and said, okay, the US's action on Iran is against international law, that could potentially put the US's cooperation with the US at risk. And we've seen that as well with the way Trump's reacted to Spain. So I think Australia has particularly adopted a very measured approach to this and has very much sought to not touch upon things like international law and things as well. So it does seem that their strategic narratives are certainly moving towards conflict de-escalation rather than outright condemnation.
Just quickly talking about China's response to the situation in Iran. I think it has been stressing that all parties should follow international law, etc., not
Yes, it
targeting
has.
civilian infrastructure. It hasn't condemned the US, I think, directly, at least from what I've seen. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, so China is certainly very much interested in, and particularly is very much interested in opposing the United States here, because China is China. China is understands China has a lot of trade with Iran. It has a lot, and it also gains a lot of natural resources from Iran as well. So there certainly is that material element as well. But also at the same time, as we were talking about before, China does have a norm in its foreign policy of non-interventionism as well. So what you see there is that China will be very willing to come out and condemn the United States for that. So yes, I should have added China in there, but yes, China and Malaysia. North Korea has also come out and condemned the action as well, but we can also see that's strategic signalling. So we can see that's certainly there is that element of opposition, but yeah, certainly among a lot of US allies and partners, they are very much careful with the language that they're using vis-a-vis the action against Iran.
So, looking forward, how might structural incentives, including shifts in US policy, as we've discussed, doctrine and state behavior in other theatres, shape the long-run interplay between cooperation and competition in the Indo-Pacific? What scenarios would suggest a reversion to conflict versus those supporting a managed order?
Okay, so this certainly, I think, depends on the regional flashpoints that we have in our region at the moment. So the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and also the Korean Peninsula. I think if we see that the United States finishes its operation in Iran, it retreats back. Domestically with Trump, attention's focused back towards Trump's issues domestically, like things like the Epstein files, and also the Trump administration's aim to crack down domestically on immigration and illegal immigration and things like that. It may shift its attention towards Taiwan, right, again. So if that's the case, we certainly could see the rise of competition. So competition could start to outweigh that cooperation, or the cooperation aspect of cooperation. However, as I was saying before, there are a lot of states also hoping to wait Trump out, right? So the thing is, if they wait Trump out, we could see the return of a more stable US policy towards the Indo-Pacific, a more stable US policy towards China, more predictable. That in some ways may reassure US allies, but at the same time, if we see that happen, we could also see attention shifted back towards the Indo-Pacific again. So you could also see competition increase in that aspect. But however, if states are able to come together, and particularly through ASEAN mechanisms and ASEAN dialogue mechanisms, also the East Asia Summit, if there can be some life injected into multilateral institutions, there could certainly be a shift back towards a more cooperative dimension, right? But I think what we're going to see is, we're going to see the intensification of, particularly as the United States focuses on itself domestically and also focuses on the Western Hemisphere and also its tariff policies. I think we're going to see increasingly that that trade is going to intra-regionalise more, and investment's going to intra-regionalise more, which means that cooperation is going to intensify. And then also at the same time is that, okay, as I was saying, if the Trump administration focus on China more, or there's a new administration that is more consistent with previous US policy or previous US strategy towards the region, we could see the intensification of the competitive dynamic, right? So I do see competition. I do see it intensifying over time.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Butcher, for your time.
Yep. Thank you. It was great.